Welcome to this workshop on the papal encyclical Magnifica Humanitas that was signed by Pope Leo on the 15th of May. The workshop is organised by the Green Christian Churches Project Group, and my name is Melanie Nazareth, and I'm the Green Christian Churches Project Officer, and so I'll be hosting this session. Now, we've all come from different things in our daily lives, bringing different things with us into this space. So actually, I always like to start this sort of thing with taking a moment just to lay down those things, knowing that we can return to them afterwards if we need to. And just let's try to be present in the moment. Let's just take a breath in and out, just to bring ourselves into the present. And our guest speaker, Fr Martin Poulsom, is going to open the session with a prayer, and then I'll introduce him properly.
Today in my church, the Roman Catholic Church, we have been remembering Saint Bonaventure, and there's an image of him here in his Franciscan robes, because he was a Franciscan, contemplating the crucified Christ. He was one of the second generation of Franciscans, so he knew Francis of Assisi personally. And this is part of a prayer which is attributed to him. May my heart always desire you, seek you and find you. May I run to you and reach you, meditate on you, speak of you, and do all things to the praise and glory of your name, with humility and discretion, with love and delight, with ease and affection, and with perseverance until the end. May you always be my only hope, my complete assurance, my wealth, my delight, my pleasure, my joy, my rest and tranquility, my peace, my delicacy, my fragrance, my sweetness, my food, my refreshment, my refuge, my help, my wisdom, my inheritance, my possession, and my treasure. In you, may my mind and heart be fixed and fastened and immovably rooted, now and always. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Martin. So Pope Leo the 14th Encyclical Magnifica Humanitas, which means magnificent humanity, is addressed to all people of goodwill. And magnificent humanity is a reference to the dignity of each one of us as human persons made in the image and likeness of God. Pope Leo's letter is primarily addressed towards the challenges of the development and the use of AI, but it offers much that can help us more widely, which is why the Church's project group thought it would be really helpful to have this webinar. And so tonight we extend a very warm welcome to Fr Martin Poulsom, who will help us explore the ways in which the letter speaks to us in the context of the climate and nature crisis. He'll speak for about, I think, half an hour to 40 minutes, following which he'll take questions for about half an hour or so. And we won't be having breakout groups tonight. We'll have a couple of announcements and we'll close in prayer by about 8:15 p.m. And you're very welcome to stay on and chat after that. Martin's a Roman Catholic priest, a Salesian of the Don Bosco order, a religious order that specialises in youth ministry. He's a senior lecturer in theology at the University of Roehampton and specialises in the theology of creation. He was previously the head of theology at Heythrop College. He's interested in the encounter between science and faith, and Martin combines the theoretical focus of his research and teaching work with various forms of practical action in justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. And he's a trustee of the climate charity Operation Noah, which many of us will know well. So Martin, thank you for your time this evening, and the floor, so to speak, is all yours.
Thank you, Melanie. When I was thinking about what I might use as a prayer today, part of the reason why I chose that part of the prayer from St. Bonaventure was I felt it was a very human prayer. It drew on a number of elements of being a human being and offered them in prayer to God. And I particularly liked the second half of the bit that I chose because it had so many beautiful metaphors which can speak of the relationship that human beings are called to have with God. And I thought that was an interesting and fitting introduction to our exploration this evening. So what I want to do to start off with is give you a few general comments about what I'm envisaging this evening. And to begin by saying what this evening will not be, which I hope won't be too much of a disappointment to anybody. So the first thing I'm not going to do is give you a summary of the papal encyclical Magnifica Humanitas, in part because to try to do so, the time scale that we've got would actually be really difficult. I'm sure that some of you have engaged with some press coverage of Magnifica Humanitas, and in a 2-minute snapshot, it's fairly easy to do it. And if we had an hour, then it might be possible to do it. But in between, I think we can use the time in a slightly different way. What we're going to be doing is exploring what Leo calls the social doctrine of the church. That's the way that he designates what he's doing. But what I won't be doing is giving you an overall account of the social doctrine of the church either, because there's not time for that even. In fact, if you want a reasonable historical overview, there's a really good one in chapter 1 of Magnifica Humanitas, which wouldn't take that long to read. One of the things I love about how Pope Leo looks at the historical tradition is that each time he embeds the particular papal contribution into the historical period of the time. And then when he gets to the end of each of the sections, he says, what can we learn from this today still? And he builds up a picture of what lasts and also what is appropriate to the time. And I think it's in that, that spirit that I want to do what we're going to do this evening. We're going to explore some themes, and some of the themes that are in Magnifica Humanitas, and we're going to do it in the context of who we are. We're going to do it in the context of being Green Christians, of being something that's happening within Green Christian. And that has an important effect on what we're going to be doing, I think, because what we're doing this evening is context sensitive to our context. So the way that I tend to approach what Roman Catholic Christians often call CST is that I understand it as a doctrine, which is the word that that Pope Leo uses, a teaching, which then develops over a historical period into a tradition of teaching. So my preferred T is the word tradition, Catholic social tradition, partly because that shows the historical reach, and also because the term tradition in our Christian understanding of it also involves responding to teaching, taking it into our lives, reflecting on it, acting on the basis of it. And it also helps us to notice that a good deal of the Catholic social doctrine is in response to things that are happening at the time, actions that people are taking. So it's a two-way process. And I think that's important for us to note as we go through, because the tradition of Catholic social doctrine and Catholic social action and Catholic social practice, I think all of those are part of what we're doing, is something that Leo recognises right at the very beginning in paragraph 1 of Magnifica Humanitas. And what we're going to do this evening is look at some text directly from the encyclical and think about how this might help us to understand what's going on, why it's going on today, and give us an opportunity to engage with it ourselves. So Pope Leo presents the doctrine that he's putting forward as part of a historical tradition. He says each generation inherits the task of shaping its own era, of guiding history to become a place where the dignity of every person is safeguarded, justice is promoted, and fraternity is made possible. Yet, every era also runs the risk of creating an inhumane and more unjust world. So, each historical moment, each movement in this developing tradition is trying to respond to particular challenges at particular times in historically situated ways. And that's exactly what Pope Leo is doing. And he's deliberately also echoing what his Leonine predecessor did in 1891, Pope Leo XIII, because he's linking back to the whole of the tradition that came out of papal teaching over that period. And right the way through this tradition, it's clear that CST has by no means been uncontroversial, whether within the Roman Catholic Church, within Christianity as a whole, or indeed in its relationships with the world. And interestingly, Pope Leo also recognises this right at the beginning in paragraph 3. When Leo XIII wrote the Encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891 on new things, our Pope Leo says this of what happened. When some objected that the church shouldn't waste energy on worldly matters, but instead focus on communicating the message of eternal life, Leo XIII responded with realism and wisdom, saying that the proclamation of the gospel cannot overlook the concrete lives of people. Christian faith is not only about the hereafter, it is also about the here and now. Okay, so if that's what this Catholic social doctrine tradition is not, then what is it? Slightly further on in the opening section of Magnifica Humanitas, Pope Leo says this: Catholic social doctrine is not a handbook of principles and norms to be applied, but a process of shared discernment. In discernment, which is a term that his predecessor, Pope Francis, made a good deal of use of during his pontificate, drawing on Francis's Jesuit background, Pope Leo, as an Augustinian, is also well used to using this term. It involves teaching, it involves reflection, it involves prayer, it involves engagement with the issues, both in the mind, in the heart, and in the hands. So it's about practice and action. And a key aspect of this, and Pope Leo has been saying this very recently in the gathering of the cardinals, is that it's shared. That term towards the end of the sentence is not there by chance. It's a shared reality. The church has to do this together. And it's only when the church does this together that the church is truly what it is being called to be. Magnifica Humanitas, magnificent humanity, is about what it means to be human in the challenging times in which we live. And so, as I start to look at some of the themes of the encyclical, I thought that was a good one to start with. What does it mean to be human, according to Pope Leo? And he has 3 ideas about it. The first one is Trinitarian. So he's coming right from the very beginning through a very faith-rich lens to look at what it means to be a human being. And he says that the deepest vocation of human persons is to enter into the Trinitarian dynamic of love, received and shared. This is a very theologically rich account from a Christian perspective. It says that the interchange of love within the persons of the Trinity give human persons not only their truest identity, but also their deepest promise. Human beings are made to be drawn into the life of the Trinity. human beings, you might even go so far to say with our Orthodox friends, is that humans are called to live the very life of the Trinity. They're drawn into God's life to live with that life. That's how great a calling it is to be a human being. Our understanding of it is Christian. So our way into this is to see the face of God, which is Jesus Christ. And that's his second move. If the mystery of God as love, the mystery of the Trinitarian persons, or as love, is the source of social doctrine, which is what he said in the first point, we see its most concrete expression in the face of Jesus Christ, the incarnate Word. So when we see the Son, we have seen the Father, as Jesus says in John's Gospel. This reminds me very much of one of my favourite early church theologians, Irenaeus of Lyon, who spoke about this very powerfully in his book Against Heresies. The first half of Irenaeus's sentence is extremely well known. The glory of God is the human person fully alive. And that fits really well with what Pope Leo is saying. The second half of Irenaeus of Lyon's statement is slightly less well known. So he says in the whole statement, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. That human life, that very same human life, is the face of God. So he's linking it then. He's saying the call for every human being is to be the glory of God in the world by being fully alive. And we see what it means to be that kind of human being by looking at the face of Christ, because he was fully human and fully divine. He is the one who shows us who and what we are called to be. Pope Leo then makes the third move. So his first move is Trinitarian, his second move is Christological. His third move, I would say, is based in his understanding of creation. Three very rich theological themes. And he says something in paragraph 50 of Magnifica Humanitas that sounds very much like Pope Francis, and I'm sure that's deliberate. Created for relationship, and you can see that in the previous two ideas, every human person is planned and willed by God to enter in communion with him, with God, with others, and with creation. Francis in Laudato Si, in a text of Laudato Si that's become very well known, I think, commenting on the narratives of creation in the book of Genesis, which is exactly what Pope Leo is doing here, said this: human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships with God, with our neighbour, and with the earth itself. And you can hear, I think deliberately, Pope Leo echoing that in this first encyclical. So what does it mean to be a human being today then? This has been a very rich theological first look. And what Pope Leo does in his second look is to say, okay, how can we talk about this in the 21st century? And he puts forward two ideas to start with: human dignity and human rights. Because he says when the church speaks like this, it creates a link with those who are not Christians, who understand the language of rights and can understand how the church uses the term dignity in its social doctrine. There's various ways of thinking about dignity, he says. You can talk about moral dignity, you can talk about existential dignity. What the Catholic social doctrine does is to talk about what he calls an ontological dignity. It's to do with the being of the human. This is how he puts it. This is the dignity that belongs to every human being simply by virtue of existing, of having been willed, created, and loved by God. And you can see him echoing his theological view there with this more, you might say, secular view, that he's trying to engage with those who don't share that Christian faith. Then he says, okay, if the church can help the world to understand that there is an ontological meaning of dignity, then what's a Christian perspective on human rights? And he makes this contribution in paragraph 54. From the Christian perspective, he says, human rights are not an external addition to the person, but an expression of an intrinsic human dignity, which the international community is called to protect and promote. So the first thing he's saying there is Christians don't add human rights to their theological understanding. Their understanding of human rights comes out of their theological understanding, and it creates a dialogue point with those who don't share that theological understanding. Because for the Christian, their understanding of ontological dignity, a human being has dignity because they exist, is linked to human rights. That's where human rights come from. These two are linked to one another. And that's an important point that he makes. He also wants to stress that it's important to recognize that human beings are limited. And he wants to do this in part because he has concerns about some of the ways in which AI and the proponents of AI present humanity as if it is capable of superseding these limits, that in the end, humans will surpass all the limits that they currently have imposed on them. And Leo is nervous about that. He's nervous about it because of the implications it has for the understanding of humanity, which we'll come on to in a couple more slides. So he wants to emphasize that it is good to be limited as a human being. And the first link that he makes is with creation. Faith, he says, helps us to recognize what we call the contingency of the things in this world. While it is right to alleviate the suffering that marks human life, it is also wise to acknowledge our fundamental finitude. Buried in this two sentences, there are two technical terms that are worth just engaging with for a moment or two. The first one is contingency, which interestingly Leo puts in inverted commas in his text, as if he's borrowing it from somewhere else. And in fact, that is exactly what he's doing. He's borrowing it from philosophy. And philosophically, contingency is the opposite of necessity. If something is necessary, then it could not be anything other than it is. If something is contingent, then it might be otherwise. So, for example, the fact that I caught the train back from Roehampton University this evening, I could have caught the bus, I could have got on a bike, I could have driven. So the fact that I caught the train is contingent. It might have been otherwise. What's interesting in the way that theologians of creation have developed and expanded this notion of contingency is that they have said within a Christian context, one of the things that being contingent can also be done, you can make it an ontological statement, a bit like Pope Leo talked about the ontological understanding of human dignity. It can be about our being, our existence. And a lot of the theologians of creation have taken this philosophical concept and said, in an expanded sense, nothing that exists has to exist. It is contingent. It might or might not be at all. And that reveals something about God, because God does not have to create in order to be God. So the motive for God to create is not out of need. God creates out of love. Love to share the divine life with other things so that they might live too. And this is a sort of expanded version of contingency. And Leo, I think, here is saying to us, this is a really helpful thing to help us to recognize the limits of our human life. Not only could we be different from the way in which we are, we might not have existed at all. And that helps us to understand how God loves us. And God loves each and every creature particularly, because all of us may or may not exist from that perspective. The other thing that he brings in is finitude, and I think he does this partly because of his worries about the way that AI thinks about the human. because he says that our finitude is fundamental. Creatures are finite, they're not infinite. The Creator is infinite. What the Creator creates is finite, it is limited. It does not last forever, it's not capable of everything that's possible, whereas the Creator does last forever and is capable of everything that is possible. And Leo is saying we need to keep hold of both of these ideas, contingency and finitude, if we're going to get what it means to be a human being right. And there are challenges here that come from the information and technological revolution that we're in the middle of at the moment. So what's the implication of finitude then? A second step that he takes a few paragraphs later in 122, he says, finitude, when truly accepted by the human person, does not diminish us, but opens us to recognizing the face of God, because we recognize that we're created out of love, and we see the face of God in Jesus, and of others. So not only the face of God, but it opens up the magnificence of other human beings too. Indeed, precisely because we experience limits, vulnerability, suffering, and failure, we can recognize the inviolable dignity of every person, both our own and that of others. So being limited is not a lack for a Christian. That's what Leo is arguing. And there are some attitudes in the current digital revolution that suggest that being limited is a lack, it's a wound, it's a problem that needs to be solved. And Leo is saying, well, not every limit is a lack. Some of them we need to look at. We need to try to address suffering. We need to try and learn from failure. Yes, of course. But we're never going to fundamentally get rid of human vulnerability because it's part of who we are. And this interplay between the positive and the negative aspects of finitude, which Leo calls in his title of this section, the limit, the heart, and the grandeur of the human person, is indeed a mystery. How these two things can be true at the same time is a mystery. But when he says we recognize the face of God, given that we recognize the face of God in Jesus, who we call Christ, we recognize that this mystery is present in him too. After all, Christ chose to be vulnerable for our sake. It opened him to his vulnerability and indeed to our vulnerability, to his dignity and our dignity as Saviour. So that's linking human limits with creation, which is a kind of first move I'm making in our direction, in our interests. He also links it with solidarity, and this will help me to move into the second thing that I want us to investigate for a few minutes. He tells a story, a historical story, a fairly short one, of the recent history of modern solidarity efforts in the last couple of hundred years. And he begins with the foundation of the Red Cross in 1893, and he goes as far as the Refugee Convention in 1951. And there's an intimation there. He doesn't say it out loud, but there's an intimation there that each of these things that he marks over that period of time arises when it arises because of what's going on in the world at that point. It's not surprising that the Red Cross is founded at the end of the 1800s. It's not surprising that the Refugee Convention is agreed in 1951. They are responses to the signs of the times, and they are human solidarity efforts that happen in the world because of the challenges that people are facing at those times. However, like Francis, his predecessor, Leo is very definitely a realist. He recognizes that none of these developments emerged without encountering resistance, narrow interests of cultural inertia. The very fragility of these achievements, the fact that they are vulnerable, the fact that they are limited, the fact that they're finite, that's the kind of link that I'm making. The very fragility of these achievements highlights how precious the responsibility is of those who initiate and sustain them. And when I read these words and when I read them again tonight, I can't help but think of the 2015 Paris COP agreement, which is looking very vulnerable indeed at the moment, but is also another moment of solidarity in the human story. Another thing that Leo takes from Francis is an account of a problem within our current culture. And it's a problem that affects the issue that he wants to concentrate on, which is artificial intelligence, but it's a problem that also has issues that are related to what we're looking at here, refugees, migrants. It has problems that come up and associate themselves with climate, as we are interested in ourselves as green Christians. And it is what both Francis in Laudato Si and now Leo in Magnifica Humanitas refer to as the technocratic paradigm. This is what Leo says about it. The pervasive technocratic paradigm in which we are immersed, and that is amplified by the digital revolution and AI, threatens to normalize an anti-human vision. If you trust in technology to solve every human problem, then you're not looking to humanity principally as the source of the response. And actually, the more you put your trust in technology, the more you make it the focus of human endeavor, the risk gets greater and greater to the human person, to the dignity, the responsibility, and the solidarity that you have with human beings. He goes on by saying, when efficiency becomes the ultimate measure of value, and that is what he's seeing in AI at its worst, human beings are tempted to see themselves as a project to be optimized, rather than as persons called to relationship and communion. And he thinks that this is an implicit risk with AI. What AI seems to do is to suggest that the limits of humanity can be solved by engaging in either a post-humanist understanding of what it means to be human, or a transhumanist understanding, and Leo looks at both of them and says both of them have a skewed vision of what it means to be human, that doesn't value the human person as such, but only sees it as a project to be completed, to get rid of all the imperfections, to make the human being perfect, to make the human being capable of anything. And one way of thinking about that in some AI models is a transhumanist understanding of human beings evolving into hybrid beings, part biological and part mechanical. And Francis says we have to be careful about that. He is wise enough to say he neither condemns AI out of hand, nor does he accept it uncritically, because he says what we need to do is discuss how we're using it, what we're using it for, whose interests are being served, and whether or not it's aiming at the good of the whole of humanity. And I think those are really valuable things to say. As we engage with the text as green Christians, I want to raise two things for us to think about and to contemplate. One of them is in connection with the earth's goods. So in paragraph 65, Leo says that the earth's goods, soil, water, air, and natural resources, are given by God to the entire human family to sustain the lives of all, and that every person has an inherent right to the use of such goods, both now and in the future. This text is understandable, given Pope Leo's emphasis. What he's trying to do here is to say that what there is available in the world isn't only there for the elite. It's not only there for some human beings. And one of the risks of some of the ways in which AI is being both presented and indeed already used is that it is not producing universal human benefit, and that's a problem. So the goods of the earth, the good things that God has created in the earth, are given to the entire human family, not only part of it. And there's a usefulness in that message. But from our perspective, as Green Christians, I think it's a legitimate question to ask whether this is a partial way of seeing things which could be expanded further. Are the earth's goods given only to human beings? I suspect many of us who are here this evening might say, well, no, they're given to the entire human family, but they're not only given to the entire human family. You might say they're given to the entire community of creation. After all, everything around us, which grows, which breathes, which sings, which does anything else you can think of, is also using the earth's goods, soil, water, air, and natural resources. So is the entire human family, whilst being a laudable circle of concern, could that circle be widened further by developing further what Pope Leo is suggesting? I think so. And one possible resource that might help us with this is work that is being done at the moment that's related to this term family. There's a number of academics, a number of popular writers, a number of people who are engaged in outreach work, looking at the term kin and thinking about this as a way of talking not only about the human family, but widening this concept of relatedness. And this relationship theme is very important to Pope Leo. Some of them are suggesting that we might think of the word kin as a verb rather than as a noun, or perhaps more a verb than a noun. And some of them, like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's quite well known for this, is a proponent of speaking about kinning as an activity. It's something that we are called to do to express our relatedness to our other than human kin or our more than human kin. There are various ways of doing this. So then when Leo says every person has an inherent right to the use of the goods of the earth, both now and in the future, there is also work being done on the notion of personhood, which is also widening our circle of concern. There's quite a lot of work being done at the moment in the legal arena to widen the term personhood as it's used in legal terminology, to incorporate things like mountains and rivers. So here's another thing that we could look at and say, when we say every person has an inherent right to the use of the earth's goods, then we could widen our circle of concern even further to take on things like rivers and mountains and forests. These, I think, are ways in which, as Green Christians, we could take this text and take its direction of travel further than it's going in this encyclical, to say, yes, absolutely, Leo, and you can take it further than that, and that might be even more useful too. A similar widening, I think, can be engaged in with another set of terms that Pope Leo uses slightly later in the encyclical, where he talks about fraternity, brotherhood and sisterhood. He says fraternity is not merely an aspiration of believers, but it is a social and political reality to be embodied in communal choices and endeavours. And a similar widening, I think, is possible here too. Who are our brothers and sisters? Well, if we think about kin and widening the sense of kin, if we think about our relatedness to other species on our planet, and evolution helps us to do that, then we can see that this expression of it here in this encyclical sounds quite human-centered. It sounds quite anthropocentric. And again, it's understandable because Leo is focusing on what it means to be a human being. And yet, all the same, might we be able to widen the sense of kinship and therefore widen the sense of fraternity. If we were able to do that, then the network of relationships which Leo talks about here, this network of relationships, however, only constitutes solidarity, that's the term that he was using earlier, in the fullest sense of the word, when it becomes a conscious choice. So fraternity is not an immediate thing. We have to choose to be brothers and sisters. We have to choose to embody our fraternity in these communal and social and political choices that we make. And if we widen this sense of kinship, widen this sense of personhood, widen this sense of fraternity and sorority, then the way that we relate to all the members of the community of creation could be expressions of these things. So I wonder, could this way of understanding solidarity then too be widened to consider the conscious choices that we make to be good members not only of the human family, but also of the community of creation? I don't think these are arguments against Leo. They are arguments which seek to say yes and even more. And I think they are valuable things for us to use in our way as green Christians of responding and thinking about and reflecting on and putting into practice what it is that Leo is doing in our way of committing ourselves to our Christian faith.
Thank you, Martin. That was very, very rich. Will probably require rewatching at some point.
Good job we recorded it then.
But nevertheless, for those of you who've managed to absorb some of it, we'd like to open the floor now to questions. And I'm going to start with Barbara.
Thank you, Manly, and thank you, Martin. That was a tour de force. Thank you so much. I have to say, though, I guess I'm a little bit feeling like we've gone backwards a little bit, in that it seems like this magnificent letter from Pope Leo, and there's so much there that one would want to go along with. He seems to have not quite to have got what you've been saying there at the end there, that it's not just humanity. We's kin. That was one of Ed's favourite terms for showing that we's kin with the whole of creation. And it rather reminds me of when Ed was working on Solicito de Re Socialis back in, 80s or 90s. And he found a couple of paragraphs that were just spot on, were really brought in the integration of creation, and that we're all part of this family, the whole created family. So I'm hoping it's just that Pope Leo is focusing just on this one subject, and that he will take on, perhaps he'll listen to what you're saying and expand more explicitly that it's not just humans that are part of this wonderful world. Do you think that's possible? I mean, am I right? Am I being too critical? Or
No, I don't think you are. And I recall that when Pope Francis wrote Fratelli Tutti, after he'd written Laudato Si, similar comments were made to say, well, what about the other half of the human race? Why have you not quoted any women in this encyclical? Because if you don't just mean brothers, fratelli, but you mean sisters as well, then there's a bigger reality that we can do. And there were other people that said this looks like a step backwards from Laudato Si. And I think one of the things that I've been helped by in Pope Leo's encyclical is his recognition that you can only talk about one main thing at once, and that you focus on that, and then you look at another challenge the next time.
Yeah, but if you've really got the integrity of creation, what that actually means,
yes, no, I agree.
Phrase your words. Yeah, you were easily able to just, by just bringing in a little bit more of a thought there to the way you phrase your words, it makes it integrates the whole of creation.
Yes,
you don't have to add another sentence.
No, you don't. I don't think you do.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Barbara.
Catherine Fish.
Thank you. Father Martin, my understanding from what you're saying is that relationship is integral to solidarity. And an American politician, I know who it was, said recently that there was a hierarchy of friendship, familial love, and he suggested the order of that hierarchy. I don't agree with him, and I don't expect you to, but I wondered if you could comment on that, please.
Yes. For those Christians who are attracted to understanding their faith in hierarchical terms, one of the things that a hierarchy can do is help you to understand which of your commitments are the most important ones. And I get that. The difficulty with a hierarchy is always that once you've established a hierarchy, the temptation, and I use that word deliberately, the temptation is only to think about those that are near the top and never to think about those that are lower down. And I think the hierarchy of the great chain of being, which was the medieval understanding of the place of humanity within the created order, had that unfortunate effect that things that were lower down in the hierarchy weren't really important, so you didn't have to worry about them, so you didn't have to think about them, so you didn't have to do anything in their defense. And that's the downside of hierarchy. And I think one of the things that a much more strongly relational account of Christianity, and I see that in what Leo's wrote, can do is it helps us to understand that relationality is something that we embody differently in different sets of circumstances, but it's not fundamentally a different reality. It's the same relationality that we are expressing in different ways. And I think that's its slight advantage over the hierarchical system, because the hierarchical system can very easily lead to, all I need to think about is this. And I think relationality helps you with that more, in part because we're used to having different kinds of relationships with different kinds of human beings, and we don't value some of them a huge amount more than others, generally speaking. And I think there's a lot more mileage, if you like, in using relationality as a starting point. I also think it's a much better vision of a human. Human beings are relational beings.
That's
By
really
definition.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before I take Judith, Martin, yeah. I've got a question here, a written question, because it's that hand that went up from yes. Richard Delavan. He says his question, building on what Kathy's was, is whether you had any thoughts on the subtextual responses in Magnifica Humanitas to some of the thoughts of people like Peter Thiel specifically, and whether there are any thoughts implied here about how Thiel has misused the thought of René Girard to prop up his ideology. You might need to explain the context of that, because I haven't got Richard to explain the context for.
Yes, and
not everyone will know.
Although I know more about René Girard than I know about Peter Thiel, there is some of that in Magnifica Humanitas. And one of the things that I think Leo is quite sensitive to, but perhaps not sensitive enough given this question, is that the context in which someone uses something fundamentally affects the way that they use it. So one of the things that I think comes through very clearly in Magnifica Humanitas is the way in which the presuppositions of someone who is moving in this digital space fundamentally affect the thing that they are producing. So he says over and over again, every large language model, every AI reflects the presuppositions, the biases, the things that are valued by those who train it, those who put it together, those who create the space within which they allow it to grow. So they're not neutral, despite the rhetoric. They're not independent, despite the rhetoric. Now, it's entirely possible that there's something going on here which is similar to that the subtext is not being given enough attention, that the way that it's using a particular author is tied more to what the person wants to do with it than being faithful to the author that they're using. And that's an important thing to raise, I think, because it makes us all aware that there is a challenge here to be faithful to your sources and also faithful to where you're wanting to go with them, and transparent about your motives. And transparency is something that comes out loud and clear in Leo's text. He makes a real appeal for the developers of AI models to be more transparent. And he tries to do it a little bit himself in a couple of places.
Thank you, Martin. I'm going to take Judith's question next.
I hope this is an intelligible question. You were talking about the earth's goods as being given to all of creation, so that all have a right to use it for sustenance now and in the future, which I think that sounds entirely proper and logical. What concerns me is that we are already exceeding 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries as humans. And so Earth Overshoot Day this year, when we consumed all the world's renewable resources, is at the end of this month. How we should respond to that as Christians, and in particular with relation to AI, that AI is forecast to be a big consumer of water, which is one of the things we are overusing already.
Yep, and precious metals, and electricity, and lots of other things. Yeah. I think our first Christian response is to try to become more informed, and I think that's what we're doing tonight. And I think it's what we all need to do, is to become more informed about the challenges and more informed about the subtexts that are going on beneath the surface, which are not being brought to the surface, which some of which Leo is trying to uncover in this text. And I think one of the other things is to make, as a result of that information, to make informed choices about our own behaviour. So for example, as someone who moves in the university space, I am faced on a daily basis with a very important choice about whether or not I will use AI, because there's a lot of pressure in the university space to use it. And it's important that we think about that. It's important that we think, well, every time I do a search in certain search engines, the first thing that comes up is an AI result. Do I want to carry on using that search engine? Do I want to be part of this? If I want to be part of it, then is it possible to be part of it in a way that might be able to change its presuppositions? And I think all of those questions, all of those responses to becoming more informed are important ones. And there may well be people on this call who are particularly concerned about the mining implications. There may be people on this call who are particularly concerned about the water implications. And those are all really important, and they're really problematic, and they need to be brought out into the open so that we can at least have a conversation about them and decide where we need to go next. Because at the moment, and this is one of the things that Leo is very strong on, all of those things are being cloaked by pretty much all the developers. All of the human costs are being cloaked by the developers of AI, and they need to be brought out into the open, and we need to recognise it for what they are. So thank you, Judith.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And a question from Catherine McLean.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. Can you see a movement starting in the same way that the Luddites revolted against the machines and broke them up in England, when the Luddites broke the machines? A movement starting which will try and break down the technological world that we've been forced to live in? by
Thank you. You said
so
you had a
many.
couple of questions. Do you want to ask the other one as well? And I can answer them both at once.
Or you can do both at once. The other question was, is this Magnifica Humanitas, is that on the same, has it got the same, is it the same as Laudato Si as far as the Catholic Church goes? Is it part of the social teaching? The third question actually is, what do you do when, this is the third question, this is my Trinitarian question. The third question is, most people don't give a monkeys, what's going on with the world as far as their actions might be destroying it. They don't give a monkeys. So that's the third question. What can you do about that? So that's three questions. I don't know if you do them all in the one time.
Okay, so the middle one's the easiest one to answer. Pope Leo makes it very clear from the outset of Magnifica Humanitas that he's intending this letter, which is what Encyclical means, this letter to be another step forward in the moves of the Catholic social tradition within the Catholic Church. In his account of Francis, he recognises Laudato Si as being part of this tradition. He also recognises Fratelli Tutti as part of this tradition too, and that's often been done. Interestingly, he also lists Pope Francis's third encyclical, Dilexit Nos, He Loves Us, as part of this tradition too, which is interesting because that third letter is not always included in this Catholic social doctrine tradition. So that's an interesting move on Leo's part. I think it's probably fair to say that in a modified way there are AI Luddites in existence in the world. I try hard not to use AI at all, so you could call me an AI Luddite. I allow my students to use it in a very, very, very tightly limited way, because, as I explained to one of my students earlier today, what I don't want you doing is handing in text that's not been generated by you, because it's your work that I want. And there's a bit of a blurred borderline there these days, I think. And it's important for us to recognize that, I think, and think about it and reflect on it. What do we want to do? And the last point that you made is absolutely well made. And I think it is true in this country, at any rate, that we are in a social and a political situation now, which is quite different from the one that we were in even 10 years ago. And in my conversations that I'm having in Operation Noah at the moment, we are often looking back and saying, it's interesting that it seems like we've rolled the clock back to a point where we're back to a stage in these debates around climate and around issues of creation and the way that the world is, that seems to be even before where we were at for the Paris COP. And that's causing a lot of concern, and it is causing a great deal of concern. And I'm sure it is in this group here, gathered here today. And I think what we're doing here today and what Green Christian tries to enable us all to do generally is a really important contribution to responding to a situation that we're in at the moment. And I think the more that we can engage in it, and the more that we can raise our voices within the Christian church and beyond the Christian churches, the more we can play our role in the social and political and cultural challenges that face us, which are not just about AI, but it's a kind of litmus test, if you like, for this trust in technology. Technology will solve all our problems as long as we get the scientists up and running and give them freedom to do whatever they like. And there are grave risks with that, as we've seen in the past. So thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, we've all seen the film 2001.
Absolutely, yeah, and the day after tomorrow, and all of those ones as well.
Yeah,
So absolutely, and we can learn a great deal from fiction, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you. Colin, I think you've got the next question.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you so much, Martin. It's been very enlightening. I'd like to ask about the question of anthropocentrism.
Yes.
There are the sort of the three points, as it were, of a triangle of focus that are talked about by some people, which is anthropocentrism or ecocentrism, that everything is equal, humans are of no particular value. If we make ourselves go extinct, ecology will still survive, and creation, I mean, probably not a particularly Christian view, creation somehow will carry on. And then there's the theocentric view. And I wondered whether you felt that perhaps Pope Leo is re-emphasizing the idea of social concern as opposed to the broader systemic concern, as it were, of creation, and the fact that creation provides us with the bread of life, literally, as well as metaphorically. And the idea of the universal destination of goods, where the previous phases of Catholic social teaching, perhaps contrary to industrialization in the 19th century and the beginnings of this sequence of encyclicals, and the contrary to Marxism and the idea of state or worker takeovers of everything, the idea of recognizing the value of private property, but not private misappropriation of benefits of economic activity. And yet that's very anthropocentric. And are we perhaps, in a sense, like we feel perhaps as green people, we feel that society is tending to move, at least in the UK, back in that direction? Oh, there's so much trouble, there's all these wars, there's all this social deprivation and difficulties, and people's cost of living is a problem, and so on. We put this climate stuff on one side, and we have to deal with that later, because we've got to feed children, and we've got to get them educated, and get the health service back on its feet, and so on. And is there a danger that that's what's happening in the current situation with this encyclical amongst the Catholic community particularly?
Okay, well, I absolutely agree with you, Colin, that there is a danger that this is happening, because I find myself, again, increasingly, and this is something that's not happened for well over 10 years, having conversations with people in which, when I mention climate, their eyes roll. I went to a summer school in Dublin last month, and even people on the summer school, it was an environmental summer school, even some of the people on the summer school were amazed that I hadn't flown to Dublin. And I said, well, why would I? And they said, well, didn't it cost you a lot more? I said, well, there's more than one way of measuring cost. Finance isn't the only possible measure of cost. And I think one of the things that is helpful to notice, and what I was trying to do towards the end was to notice that you don't necessarily have to set these visions off against each other. They're not necessarily competitive. So the way that I would engage with what I perceive, and I think you've picked it up very much, I do perceive his account as being somewhat anthropocentric, and there's a problem with that. And I'm sure that he is aware of that, because he's quite a well-read chap. And he might say, yes, okay, Martin, I'm writing a thing about being human, so it is anthropocentric because that's my topic. And I very much hope, and this is what Barbara was saying earlier, I very much hope that he will write something else that will have a wider scope and allow him to say everything that I was saying then, I can say now, because it's based on the same rationale. It's based on this rationale of relationality. And we can use the same basis of the rationale of relationality and of God creating the world for relationship. And we can do it to look at the ecological issues as well. And I very much hope that during his pontificate, he's going to be able to do that. I do think, however, that there are very, very strong currents in our society at the moment that are saying precisely the things that you were saying. We've got to look after the education of our kids. We've got to try and keep cool. We've got to try and keep our NHS going. And my response to them, people that do say that, is I say, well, but do you not see that all of those are climate-related issues? That if we do nothing about the climate, in 20 years, it'll be even hotter, the NHS will be even more stretched, and it will be more and more difficult for our young people to be schooled because of the economic implications of climate change. And actually all these issues are joined together. They are very much interconnected with one another. And I think one of the things that sometimes happens is that when you see the interconnections, when people see the interconnections, they get really scared. And I think that has been the response of some people to the people's emergency briefing screenings that have been happening across the country in the last 4 months. Some people have come out of them and said, my goodness, I didn't even know it was that bad. I didn't know we were on the verge of catastrophe. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that people do know, because they are all interconnected problems. So thanks, Colin, for raising that for us.
I'm afraid that we've reached a point where I'm going to have to call an end to the formal questions. But at the end of this formal session, right after Barbara tells us about the next Green Christian workshop, the link will stay open for anyone who wants to stay to talk further. And if you have some points you want to make or some discussion that you want to have, that might be a good chance to have it. But Martin, I'd like to thank you for your generosity with your time and your knowledge. Your talk was incredibly rich and fascinating and also practical, and has left me, and I'm sure everyone else, with much to reflect on. I'm glad that you've been able to point out some of the difficulties with Magnifica Humanitas and ways that we might look at it that might overcome the barriers in actually accessing the content. Do stay on if you'd like to, Martin. It'd be lovely to have you join the post-workshop conversation, but I do know that you've got a lot of other things to attend to, so there's no obligation.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask Judith now to lead us in a final prayer.
It's a kind of prayer. It's also a kind of poem. It's written by Joy Cowley, Ewa Torea Psalms. But I was trying to think something that picked up on all the things that Martin's been talking about. It's called The Bridge. There are times in life when we are called to be bridges, not a great monument spanning a distance and carrying loads of heavy traffic, but a simple bridge to help one person from here to there over some difficulty, such as pain, grief, fear, loneliness. A bridge which opens a way for ongoing journey. When I become a bridge for another, I bring upon myself a blessing, for I escape from the small prison of self and exist for a wider world, breaking out to be a larger being who can enter another's pain and rejoice in another's triumph. I know of only one greater blessing in this life, and that is to allow someone else to be a bridge for me. Amen.
Amen. I'll come back to you in a moment, Judith, but I'd like to just thank you and to David and to Barbara for their help this evening. And a huge thank you to each and every one of you for coming, because it is so important, as Martin said, that we engage in these discussions and these reflections as we think about how we move forward in the current circumstances and in the really raw and difficult facts of the climate crisis. So to those who are leaving us now, go in peace in this always challenging world. And for those who are staying, it'll be over to you in a minute. But first, please make a note in your diaries. Judith, back to you.
The first Wednesday in September will be a workshop, and it's going to be led by the amazing Deborah Colvin, who was here earlier in the talk and has now left. But I heard her speak earlier this summer about rivers, and particularly about the river basin for the Thames and how amazing that is, and how interconnected it is. And then she was linking that to our sense of home. And I find it a really interesting talk. And so the idea is that you come and talk to us on that topic during Creation Tide, because it's about finding our place, our home within all of creation.